It began not with a public announcement, but with a whisper that slipped out of Brussels. A single leaked page, barely a fragment of a larger document, carried words heavy enough to shake the foundation of global trade. Behind closed doors, former President Donald Trump stood before NATO allies and delivered a demand that sounded less like policy and more like a threat. Raise tariffs on Africa, choke their lifeline of oil and gold, make them bend, or watch them starve. The words were brutal, and the meaning was clear. Africa's most precious resources, oil and gold, were being treated not as the property of sovereign nations, but as bargaining chips to maintain Western dominance. For decades, these resources had fueled European industry and secured Western wealth, while African families struggled with poverty in the very lands where those treasures were pulled from the ground. This time, the demand was explicit. Either surrender sovereignty or face economic suffocation. But in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the reaction was not fear. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not tremble. He recognized the move for what it was: economic warfare disguised as diplomacy, and instead of bowing his head, he raised his voice. Within hours of the leak spreading, headlines echoed across African capitals. Europe targets Africa's oil and gold. Young people on social media began asking the same question: how long will we allow outsiders to dictate our future? Mothers in small villages worried about medicine and school fees. Farmers wondered if their crops would find buyers. Yet beneath the concern, a new feeling stirred: pride. The sense that Africa, for the first time in generations, might be ready to stand tall even in the face of hardship. That night, Traoré gathered his advisors. His words were simple, but unshakable. If we bow today, we will be slaves tomorrow. And with that, the course of history began to shift. What followed was not a quiet negotiation, but a defiance that would unite a continent and send shockwaves through Washington, Brussels, and beyond. The memo that slipped out of Brussels spread across Africa like wildfire. By dawn, newspapers in Bamako, Conakry, and Ouagadougou carried the same headline: Europe targets Africa's oil and gold. It was no longer rumor. It was confirmation of what many had suspected for years, that behind the speeches about partnership and cooperation, powerful nations still viewed Africa as a source of wealth to be controlled, not as a partner to be respected. In Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré wasted no time. He summoned his closest advisors before sunrise. The room was tense, the air heavy with the knowledge that what they decided could determine the fate of millions. Traoré did not speak in riddles. He spoke plainly. "This is not about tariffs," he said. "This is about control. They want our oil, our gold, and ultimately our sovereignty. If we bow today, we will be slaves tomorrow." His words were not dramatic. They were rooted in the lived history of Africa. For centuries, foreign powers had taken Africa's treasures and left behind poverty. Gold had flowed out of West Africa into European vaults. Oil had been drilled and shipped abroad, while villages nearby remained without electricity. To many, tariffs were simply another chain in a long line of exploitation. But this time, Traoré was determined to break that chain. By mid-morning, emergency calls had gone out to Mali, Guinea, and Niger. Within days, leaders of the Sahel gathered in a closed summit. The location was symbolic: not Paris, not Geneva, but the heart of West Africa, far from the polished conference halls where outsiders had long dictated terms. The doors were heavy, the air filled with the gravity of the moment. Each leader spoke of the same wounds: gold siphoned away through shadow contracts, oil fields dominated by foreign firms, revenues disappearing overseas while their people lived in scarcity. For the first time in decades, the conversation was not about aid packages or foreign loans. It was about standing together. Traoré set the tone. If they dare impose tariffs, then we will dare something greater. We will shut down the flow of oil and gold to their markets, and we will find new partners who respect us. The room fell silent. The decision was dangerous. Refusing Western markets could bring hardship in the short term. But one by one, the leaders nodded. Slowly, Africa's fractured voices converged into one answer. Word of the decision spread quickly, not through official communiques, but through whispers carried by radio stations and shared on social media. Soon the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey echoed with chants. If they want our oil and gold, they will have to take our dignity too. In markets, merchants debated the risks of higher prices. Mothers worried about school fees and medicine. Farmers asked if their harvests would still reach buyers. But beneath the uncertainty, something deeper grew: pride. For the first time, people felt that their leaders were willing to sacrifice comfort to defend dignity. In Independence Square, a young student raised a cardboard sign that captured the mood of the continent. Better to endure hunger for a year than slavery for a century. The crowd roared in agreement. The phrase spread across Africa, painted on walls, repeated in sermons, and whispered in marketplaces. It was more than a slogan. It was a declaration that dignity was worth sacrifice. When Traoré appeared on national television, his face was calm, but his words struck deep. We may suffer in the short term, but suffering with dignity is better than living forever on our knees. Those words resonated across the continent. They were replayed in small villages where radios were the only window to the world. They were quoted in classrooms where children scribbled them in notebooks. They were shared by diaspora communities far from Africa's shores, who felt in his defiance a reflection of their own struggles. But while ordinary Africans rallied behind their leaders, in Europe and Washington, the reaction was very different. Markets panicked, ministers argued, and for the first time, powerful nations realized they might be facing a crisis of their own making. The first tremors of Africa's defiance were felt not in dusty markets or village squares, but on the trading floors of Europe. In Frankfurt, gold prices shot upward, screens flashing red as traders scrambled to understand the sudden shift. In Paris, energy planners confronted a chilling fact. More than half of the uranium powering France's nuclear grid came from Niger, and that supply line was no longer guaranteed. In Milan, executives from the electric car industry panicked as cobalt and lithium contracts from the Congo began slipping into the hands of non-Western buyers. It became clear that what had been dismissed as symbolic rhetoric carried the weight of real consequences. In Brussels, ministers gathered late into the night. On the surface, they spoke of partnership and dialogue, but the memos on their desks told a different story. Without Africa's resources, European economies would struggle. Oil and gold were not luxuries. They were oxygen. For the first time, officials admitted in hushed tones that Europe needed Africa far more than Africa needed Europe. A German minister put it bluntly in a private session: "If we sanction Africa, we sanction ourselves. Yet no one dared to voice that truth publicly. To defy Washington openly would be political suicide. Across the Atlantic, Donald Trump thundered at rallies, vowing to teach Africa its place. His supporters roared with approval. But diplomats listening abroad heard something more troubling. They heard the sound of a global order cracking under its own arrogance. The more Washington threatened, the more African leaders appeared not as reckless populists, but as symbols of dignity. As Western leaders wrestled with division, the BRICS nations moved quickly. In Beijing, trade officials announced emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks. In Moscow, delegations arrived with proposals for joint ventures in gold refining and oil drilling. New Delhi made the boldest gesture of all, pledging long-term agreements to purchase Sahelian crude, ensuring a market even if Europe turned away. Each move sent a clear signal. Africa would not stand alone. Inside Africa, these offers brought both relief and caution. Leaders welcomed support, but they remembered history. Replacing one dependency with another would only repeat old mistakes. At the summit of Sahel states, Traoré and his allies began crafting something new, an African resource charter. Its principle was simple but revolutionary. Oil, gold, and other raw materials would no longer be treated as commodities to be plundered. They would be instruments of sovereignty, tools to shape Africa's destiny rather than chains to hold it down. On the streets, ordinary Africans felt the pressure. Prices rose. Medicines became harder to find. Families tightened their belts. Yet instead of breaking, communities began to close ranks. Volunteers distributed food in rural villages. Students organized networks to keep schools open. Farmers pooled resources to bring harvests to market without foreign middlemen. Hardship was real, but so was unity. The turning point came with a speech that electrified the continent. On national television, Traoré stood at a simple podium, not surrounded by generals or bureaucrats, but by miners in dusty overalls, farmers with calloused hands, and engineers in worn jackets. His words were plain but powerful. They say we are reckless. I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. From this day forward, they will no longer flow without dignity. The reaction was immediate. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight, showing barrels of oil wrapped in African flags. In Kinshasa, marketplaces erupted in cheers as the speech replayed on radios. Across the diaspora, young Africans shared one phrase: "If Traoré stands, we stand." Western media tried to dismiss the moment as reckless defiance. But the images of ordinary workers standing shoulder to shoulder with their president struck a chord far beyond Africa. In South America, activists saw their own struggles reflected. In Asia, commentators spoke of a new axis of dignity. But just as Africa's voice grew louder, a new revelation threatened to push the crisis into uncharted territory. Another leak was about to expose the true depth of Western plans. And this time, the mask would fall completely. The days that followed revealed the full weight of Western retaliation. European banks began freezing accounts tied to African state-owned companies. Cargo ships carrying crude oil and gold were halted in Mediterranean ports, their paperwork suddenly deemed under review. Insurance firms headquartered in London and Paris refused to cover African shipments, leaving exporters stranded. The lifeblood of African economies was trapped on the docks, not because of storms at sea, but because of signatures in boardrooms thousands of miles away. Then came the digital assault. Anonymous cyber units probed the servers of governments in Ouagadougou and Bamako. Financial transfers failed. Electricity grids flickered and collapsed. Government websites crashed without warning. Western media outlets coordinated their coverage, painting Ibrahim Traoré as a reckless strongman dragging his country toward ruin. Editorials warned of famine, chaos, and rebellion. The message was clear. Africa's resistance would not go unpunished. Yet on the ground, the story unfolded differently. Yes, families felt the strain. Prices climbed, medicines grew scarce, and school fees weighed heavier than before. But rather than shatter under the pressure, communities began to tighten their bonds. In dusty villages, volunteers distributed food so no family would go hungry. Students organized solidarity networks, ensuring that children could continue their studies even when resources were short. Farmers worked together to bring harvests to local markets, bypassing foreign middlemen. What was meant to divide Africa was instead welding it together. Inside African capitals, the political consequences were just as dramatic. Leaders of the Sahel states met in emergency sessions, no longer as isolated governments, but as allies in a shared struggle. Resource convoys were placed under joint protection by regional security forces. Local banks introduced gold-backed payment systems to bypass Western financial channels. Engineers in Niger and Mali worked overnight to stabilize national power grids. In Burkina Faso, the government announced the creation of a national reserve fund, built from oil and gold revenues, to shield the people from external shocks. These were not acts of desperation. They were acts of resilience. For ordinary Africans, the hardships were undeniable, but so was the pride. In city streets, rallies formed spontaneously. People carried placards reading, "Better hunger with dignity than slavery with wealth." In markets, merchants raised their voices, saying they would endure short-term losses if it meant independence for their children. In classrooms, teachers reminded students that their parents and grandparents had endured worse under colonialism, and that this moment was part of a larger story of liberation. The political mood shifted as well. Opposition parties that once criticized governments for weakness began to rally behind the call for sovereignty. Regional parliaments debated not whether to resist, but how best to do it. Even leaders once seen as cautious began to echo Traoré's words. In Ghana, lawmakers asked if their contracts with foreign companies needed review. In Nigeria, student unions demanded protection for local industries. Across Africa, the idea of sovereignty was no longer abstract. It was alive in the choices of everyday people. Diaspora communities responded with equal passion. In Paris, young Africans marched through the streets, chanting in support of their homeland. In New York, activists gathered outside corporate headquarters, demanding transparency in how African resources were exploited. For the first time, Africans abroad and at home were united in outrage and determination. What shocked Western policymakers most was not the resistance of governments, but the unity of the people. Economic hardship, instead of fueling rebellion, was fueling solidarity. Attempts to break morale had created the opposite effect. The more Africa was pressured, the more its people rallied together. But just as Africa was finding strength in unity, a second leak emerged, one that would strip away all pretense and reveal the true scope of the West's designs. What had begun as a fight over tariffs was about to be exposed as something far darker. As the standoff deepened, Washington doubled down. Former President Trump used his rallies to frame the crisis as a test of Western strength. He promised to make Africa crawl back, his words echoing across American television screens. To his supporters, the message sounded like dominance restored. To the rest of the world, it sounded like arrogance that could no longer be sustained. Behind the fiery speeches, U.S. officials worked frantically. Diplomats pressured African capitals, urging leaders to reconsider their defiance. Financial threats were quietly delivered through back channels. State Department officials warned that rejecting tariffs would destabilize the region. Intelligence operatives spread rumors of chaos in West Africa. But the warnings had lost their sting. African leaders had already seen through the pattern. This was not about stability. It was about control. In Europe, divisions grew sharper. Some ministers repeated Washington's line, insisting Africa would eventually surrender. Others looked at their industries on the brink of collapse and whispered a different truth. Without African resources, Europe's green revolution, its energy security, and its financial stability were all at risk. Public debates grew louder. Labor unions asked why European workers should suffer to enforce a tariff war. Commentators began to ask the unthinkable. Had the West underestimated Africa's power? Beyond the West, the reaction was swift and decisive. China, Russia, and India moved to secure their positions. Beijing extended credit lines that bypassed Western banks. Moscow proposed joint ventures in refining and drilling. New Delhi offered long-term contracts for Sahelian oil, ensuring a market regardless of sanctions. Across South America and the Caribbean, leaders of African descent voiced solidarity. Even within the United States, historically black colleges and professional networks expressed interest in building bridges with Africa rather than walls. The global balance was shifting. For generations, Africa had been forced to react to the world. Now, the world was reacting to Africa. Every move in Washington or Brussels seemed to strengthen the resolve of ordinary Africans rather than weaken it. What began as a tariff dispute had become a symbol of dignity versus domination, sovereignty versus control. And just when Western leaders thought they could contain the damage, a second leak emerged that stripped away every mask, exposing a plan far more dangerous than tariffs. The second leak removed every shadow of doubt. Documents revealed secret plans to privatize Africa's oil and gold, to lock away resources for half a century, and to funnel profits into offshore accounts controlled from Western capitals. For many Africans, it was not a surprise. It was confirmation of what their grandparents had always warned. The chains of dependency had never been broken. They had only changed their shape. The outrage that followed was unlike anything in recent memory. Crowds filled the streets of Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Kinshasa. Diaspora communities in Paris and New York carried placards reading, "No more hidden chains." The African Union announced a continent-wide investigation into foreign contracts signed over the past 2 decades. Parliamentarians who had once hesitated now spoke with clarity. This was not about policy. It was about theft. Standing before a packed hall of lawmakers, Ibrahim Traoré spoke words that echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. They wanted to steal not just our oil and gold, but our future. If we allow this, then every sacrifice our people have endured is meaningless. But if we resist, we turn their theft into our rebirth. The chamber erupted in thunderous applause. Across the continent, families who had tightened their belts during shortages now felt their suffering was not in vain. It was proof that Africa was defending itself against another century of exploitation. For the West, the narrative had flipped. What began as a tariff strategy was now a referendum on Africa's right to exist with dignity. What began as an attempt to impose control had exposed the depth of Western dependence. Oil and gold were no longer symbols of plunder. They had become symbols of sovereignty. The choice that remains is not Africa's alone. It is a choice for the world. Will nations continue to treat Africa as a marketplace to be exploited, or will they accept Africa as an equal partner in shaping the future? If this story makes you pause, reflect on what it means. Think of the sacrifices of past generations and the courage of today's leaders. Consider what it means for dignity to matter more than gold, for sovereignty to matter more than comfort. Africa has spoken with one voice. The question now is, will the world listen?